Good evening to all of you. Let me begin my lecture today by thanking the Calicut Heritage Forum, C.K. Ramachandran sir, M.G.S. Narayanan sir, and the family of Professor K.V. Krishna Ayyar for giving me this opportunity. I have prepared these lecture notes that are part of my ongoing research on the subject of China's diplomatic history and its connections with southern India. In terms of the structure of today's talk, I have divided it into 4 key sub-themes, which hopefully would give you a better insight into the historical connections that once existed, and also into the work that this research has spawned in terms of 2 academic non-fiction films that I made, so that the rich history of Chinese connections to this part of the world can be accessible to a much wider audience. I'd first be discussing the origins and time frame to situate China's outreach to Kerala. The second segment would discuss the routes and destinations that the Chinese traversed while reaching to this part of the world. In my third segment, I would recount the connections that they maintained with Kerala, where the specific context of Calicut emerges, and their descriptions of this place in their literary works. I would also discuss the final voyages and how all of these maritime outreach efforts finally came to an unfortunate end, replaced eventually by other external actors in this part of the world. And lastly, I would discuss the findings of 2 of my non-fiction films, as I mentioned, on Chinese connections with South India. Now, from the introductory remarks in this evening session, we are fairly clear that China once had a thriving commercial and cultural interaction with southern India, which peaks somewhere between the 12th and the 15th century. At least 3 dynasties, as the speaker before me pointed out: the Sung dynasty between the 10th and the 13th century, the Yuan dynasty, which was a Mongol dynasty from the 13th to 14th century, and the Ming dynasty from the late 14th to sometime around the mid 15th century, promoted maritime links to this part of the world quite actively. There are historians who have noted how, after the flooding of the ancient Indian port of Muziris in 1341, Calicut had emerged as the most important port, not only in India, but in the whole of South Asia. It is interesting to remind ourselves that while maritime outreach to Kerala peaked during the Ming dynasty, even before the Ming dynasty, at the time of the Sung dynasty and the Yuan dynasty, there are travelers from Kerala, from China, who have described Calicut as the most important harbor in the Western Ocean, or as the meeting point of all foreign merchants in the region. It is interesting to note that China did not have a national sea-going navy established on a permanent basis until the southern Sung dynasty came to power in the 12th century, and they had to deal with the primary task of protection of coasts and carrying out state-sponsored tribute trade of silk and porcelain with Southeast Asian countries and littoral states in South India. Subsequently, the Yuan dynasty, which was a dynasty of Mongols, also had an interest in developing marine power, but this was slightly more aggressive compared to the Sung, and this was for the purposes of war in pursuance of a policy of universal domination. This, however, wasn't the case with the Ming dynasty. The primary and continuous connection which Calicut is believed to have had was during this period under the Ming dynasty, and particularly led by the famous Ming general Zheng He, who made 7 voyages across the Indian Ocean in the early 15th century with vast fleets. Much of the maritime outreach to this part of the world was centered on cultivating tributary relationships, which was based on a Sinocentric world order. The previous speaker mentioned Chungkuo. Chungkuo actually means the Middle Kingdom. And this is the basis of China's own conception about themselves of being situated geographically right at the middle of the world if you were to flatten out a map, and also in terms of the accomplishments that they had by that time, their invention of the gunpowder, paper currency, their developments in porcelain, fine arts, ceramics, and so on. So this was the idea of being culturally superior to other civilizations around them, and they sought acknowledgement of this cosmological centrality by reaching out to hosts in different countries through symbolic exchange of tributes. In the context of the Ming voyages, as this caricature shows, the Ming dynasty was much ahead of their times as far as shipbuilding and maritime outreach was concerned. You can imagine the kind of grand sight that this presented when you had roughly 62 large ships and 225 small ships docking in small city-states like Calicut, like Kochi, like Kollam, and so on. And they had roughly 28,000 men on board. The largest of these ships were roughly 440 feet long and 186 feet wide. The length would be about 150 meters, still roughly half the size of today's tonnage ships. And these ships were several times larger than the ships that were used by Europeans in the later periods. If we were to look at the routes and destinations that the Chinese took, the Chinese voyages to this part of the world originated from Nanjing, here, and Fujian province. Nanjing at that time was the capital. They traversed through the South China Sea, if you can follow the route, through the South China Sea, entering into what is presently the Straits of Malacca, and there onwards entering towards the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, Sri Lanka, then known as Shilan, and there onwards to Kerala. Scholars such as Harprasad Ray point out that Chinese travels to this part of the world made popular the usage of the term Western Ocean for the first time. So if you look at Chinese travelers during the Yuan period, or even before that, during the Sung dynasty period, travelers like Wang Taiyuan or Chao Rukwa, their idea of the Western Ocean, or Xiyang, comprised the littoral states of the northern shores of the Indian Ocean, including the Bay of Bengal. This was their Western Ocean, and also extending to the west coast of India as far as the Arabian Sea. However, it was until the Ming voyages, there was no exact demarcation between what constituted the end of the Eastern Ocean and where the Western Ocean began. So the Ming dynasty outreach actually popularized their own geographic sense of how the world was divided spatially. And for them, Western Ocean thereafter became the west of Java. The west of Java, anything beyond this westwards became Western Ocean, and Java was the outer limit of them for the Eastern Ocean. Much of this travel and the itineraries around it were organized around the annual cycle of the monsoon winds. So you had the northeast monsoons pressing them to come down, and they could return subsequently with the southwest monsoons. In Chang He's case, the first 3 voyages set sail from Fujian. This is where the first 3 of his voyages took off, and he sailed southwards to Chinese Vietnam, then to the kingdom of Champa, and further down to the areas around Java and Sumatra, and then westwards to the Malabar coast of southwest India. The outward voyage, as I mentioned, coincided with the winter monsoon, which was the northeast monsoon, and the return voyage that brought them home was the summer monsoon of the following year. So this should give you a sense that if they were dependent on wind conditions, they would have had to wait for several months before the wind direction changed. And that allows us the scope and space to imagine why their presence here was logical and why they had to sort of remain in this place for a certain period of time. According to scholars such as Ray Huang, on an average, each voyage lasted about 20 months. On later voyages, either the whole fleet, or when the whole fleet could not move together, at least some ships, they reached the Persian Gulf area, the Arabian Peninsula, the Muslim holy city of Mecca, and also trade ports of East Africa. According to historians like Louis Levates, once they were at sea, how they navigated their way, because at that time we know that navigation techniques were quite limited. So the ship's pilots, they navigated principally by means of the water compass, and they measured time by using graded incense sticks. A small basin in the center of the compass was filled with yang water, which was basically sea water taken from the upside of the ship, and a magnetized needle in the shape of a flat fish was placed on the water, where it slowly drifted to a north-south direction. In terms of their division of time, once they were out at sea, a day was broken into 10 watches of 2.4 hours each. Interestingly, the first giraffe that was to be seen in China is believed to have come from Zheng He's fourth visit to India, when one of the smaller fleets, once they were docked in Calicut, one of the smaller fleets under another eunuch called Hoshian journeyed to Bengal, and the king there, Saifuddin, presented a tribute to the emperor through his envoys, and this was sometime in the year 1414. And the giraffe was given to him by the ruler of Malindi in Africa. The point here is that in terms of their engagement, especially with the maritime world, the early Ming rulers were more engaged with the maritime world overall compared to the land-based outreach that you see in previous dynasties. The nature of the outreach, as I mentioned, it focused on China's civilizing influence and imperial legitimation through the cultivation of tributary relationships. The kind of tributes that were expected from local city-states could be anything. It could be a giraffe, it could be a certain percentage of your quarterly production of agriculture, it could be a few ounces of dust. It depended on whatever you wanted to sort of acknowledge as far as the hierarchical relationship with the Chinese emperor was concerned. That is the only point that they were interested to stress. The other interesting thing about these maritime outreach efforts was the repeated stress on the non-trade dimension of the outreach compared to their predecessors. So unlike the Sung and the Yuan dynasties, the purpose for the Ming dynasty to a large extent was to actually engage tributary relationships with the smaller city-states and to convey the benevolence of the emperor sitting in Beijing to the barbarians, as they called them. Under the Ming dynasty, and particularly under the initial emperor Hongwu and subsequently under Yongle, trade was allowed under official auspices only when a tribute was presented. They prohibited private trade between the Chinese and the barbarians, and they wanted them to use Chinese substitutes. This is an interesting way of, looking at, maybe possibly when we look at how trade was organized between countries, this is an interesting way of looking at how maybe promotion of domestic production itself was being encouraged by encouraging only official trade and for the rest of them to use Chinese substitutes. This eventually, however, gave way to private trade as well, which would have been overlooked or even encouraged by the eunuch ambassadors who were responsible for many of these missions. So the people that I mentioned, whether it was Zheng He, whether it was Hoshian, whether it was the others who were leading these voyages, they were eunuchs put to the service of the court. And because eunuchs could not buy land, they used to encourage private trade on the side, even though the emperor might not have been very keen in encouraging trade, because the purpose of being an emperor was not to accumulate profit through bartering and trade and other things. Tribute was fine. In terms of the connections with Kerala, as some of the earlier speakers mentioned, Chinese goods have become part of daily life in Kerala. If we look at items of daily use, we are familiar with the cooking vessel or the wok that we use, the china chatti, or silk that we use, china pattu, or the china barani. All of these are prefixed with the word China, which attests to the cross-fertilizing influence of the relationship with China across the three dynasties that I mentioned. The China wala here that you can see, these fishing nets are similar to those used by fishermen in the fishing lakes of Yunnan, and such fishing methods were learned from crew members from Yunnan when they made stopovers in Kollam and Kochi. Regarding Guli, as Kozhikode was called in Chinese literature. Travelers like Ma Huan, Kung Chen, and others such as Fei Xin, they have described Kozhikode or Guli variously as the great country of the Western Ocean. So the notion of Western Ocean as a geographic space, and then the great country, Calicut, our Calicut was the great country of this Western Ocean. And others alternately also describe this as an important trade center for the countries of the Western Ocean. This map that you see here, in terms of cartographic evidences, is one of the most important maps that are available to us. This is known as the Wu Peicher. This is an early 17th century map, which is a fantastic source of Chinese navigation routes, which were actually redrawn after Cheng He's original maps. Now, although these directions here, they lack the north, south, east, west orientation, but the map actually gives us into a peek of the Chinese navigation routes. So you can actually identify places like Malindi on the east coast of Africa, and this entire stretch therefore gets interpreted as the east coast of Africa, including places like Mogadishu. And if you look at, or like I mentioned, it doesn't have a north, south, east, west orientation, but it still shows where possibly the Chinese entered. So you have a description relating to Shilan or Ceylon, and then you also have fantastic descriptions of Shaugerlan or Kollam, Kircher, Kochi, Kulikwo, Kozhikode, and Fandarana or Pandalayani. This was a fantastic insight as far as places were concerned, as far as entry points were concerned. And it is fascinating to note that Kollam seems to have been the farthest point that a Chinese ship had ever reached in the 12th century. So that was before the Ming dynasty. In most of their literature and most of their accounts, we frequently see the usage of Shaochunan or Shaukerlan, as Kollam was known. And subsequently, when you see the mention much more frequently of places like Kulikwo or Kircher, it also reminds us of the importance that Calicut had gained over a period of time in the specific context of its prominence as a trade entity. Historians also note that the Zamorin of Calicut had declared it to be a free port, and even vessels that were headed to other destinations could actually stop here for water and other provisions. Now, there are other travelers like Ibn Battuta, who in the mid-14th century, particularly his work translated by Gibb, mentions how the port of Calicut was an important site where he had sighted 13 Chinese vessels. Ibn Battuta, on his way to China, had also recorded waiting here in Calicut for 3 months, awaiting the season of voyage to China to begin. On the Sea of China, according to Ibn Battuta, traveling was done in Chinese ships only. So basically, he had described three kinds of ships. The large ones, if you can spot the large ones, and then the mid-sized ones, and then the smaller ships, which were known as karkams. And he had taken one of these vessels from Kollam after he could not find accommodation on a ship to China from Calicut. So he traveled from Calicut to Kollam and thereafter. And this was during the Yuan dynasty. Now, Calicut was the most important destination that was reached by Cheng He's fleet on its first 3 voyages. So when you look at the first 3 voyages that Cheng He undertook out of his 7 voyages, Calicut was the outer limit that he had reached. Calicut by then was a great state. This is one of the actual replicas. I think owing to the lighting here, we are not able to see the actual ship. This was one of the original 1:1 size replicas of the ships that were there in Cheng He's voyage. This again is one of the bells that was actually recovered from Cheng He's voyages that were actually on his ship. In terms of Calicut's predominance, by then the Ming dynasty was very keen to pursue this relationship with Calicut, much more than the relevance places like Kollam or Alva, in fact, had. Calicut was a great state, and should Calicut be willing to establish diplomatic ties, it would encourage other smaller states to also follow suit. So there was that kind of relevance as well. Cheng He receives his first orders to travel to Kerala sometime in the month of July 1405. This is the early 15th century. But it is very interesting to note that when you look at the Ming She Lu records, the original records from the Ming dynasty, there is an entry in the same year of the visit by Shamiti or Samudri or Zamorin, as he was known as, being on one of the ships, returning ships, which was led by another imperial envoy called Yin Cheng. So the interesting thing here is that even before Cheng He was the most magnificent of these travelers, but even before he undertook these big voyages, these grand voyages, there were other ambassadors who were being sent, and in fact representation from city-states was going back to China even before Cheng He had begun. Cheng He's first mission, as I mentioned, in the Ming She Lu is dated between 1405 and 1407. Upon his arrival in Calicut, Cheng He presented the imperial decree of the Yongle emperor. What was this decree? This decree was basically conferring an additional title of king upon the king of Calicut. So there was a ritualistic element to this outreach. There was a symbolism built into this. And Cheng He is also recorded to have bestowed a silver seal for the kingship. In addition to this, Chinese court dresses were given to courtiers in Calicut. This is all recorded. And there's also mention of a memorial being erected on that particular visit, according to one of the historians, Tasho Huang. According to other historians, bartering, as you can see, this is from my fieldwork here in the Silk Street, where you have the bust of a Chinese and Indian trader. According to historians, bartering had a ritual of its own. Let me see if the image can be. Yeah, all right. Bartering had a ritual of its own. First, one of Cheng He's officers and an Indian broker would set a date to discuss prices for the goods from the treasure ships. On that day, the men would go over to the ship and inspect the cargo piece by piece. One of the translations of Ma Huan, who was a traveler on Cheng He's voyages, reveals that when a ship from China arrived, the king's overseer with a chitti was a person entrusted to handle finances and valuation. They would go on board and make an invoice of the goods. A day was settled for valuing the cargo. On that appointed day, the silk goods were first inspected and valued, and when the prices had been decided, all involved would join hands and vow not to change the price thereafter. If done quickly, bartering could be settled within a month. If not, it could take 2 to 3 months. So the first point that I mentioned, that navigation was dependent on climatic conditions, had to be paired with the second aspect, that negotiations could also take time, because of which the believability of why the Chinese may have spent time here becomes much more thorough. The goods were then exchanged at the prices that had been decided without the slightest deviation. The Zamorin also collected duty on all trade. This is also very interesting. In terms of market mechanisms, I introduced to you the idea that clearly they were trying to promote trade, use of Chinese substitutes, they were trying to protect domestic markets. And now when you look at bartering happening on a negotiable basis, the idea or the beginnings of free market also seem to be embedded in some of these practices. On the return trip, envoys from Calicut and Shaugalan, that is Kollam, are recorded to have come with Cheng He and offered a tribute of local products to the emperor. Now this is again a representation of Cheng He returning. I mean, you can possibly see the giraffe there, and this is a replica which has been erected in the Tianfei Museum, which is several hours journey from Beijing to the north. Besides Kozhikode and Kollam, there were other city-states such as Samudra, Malacca, etc. that also sent their ambassadors back with Changha at the end of his first voyage. Paper money, silks and copper cash as appropriate were conferred upon the envoys, and this is recorded in the year 1407. The second mission lasted from 1407 to 1409. Now, if ambassadors had been sort of brought with Changha in the return trips, you would imagine how did they return? So they would usually return when the next voyage used to take place. The second mission, it lasted from 1407 to 1409. The ambassadors were sent back during these return trips. According to Edward Dreyer, the main charge of the second visit was to confer formal investiture on the king of Calicut, and this is dated to October 1407. Now, interestingly, the titles that were used for the rulers of Erenad, and I am no specialist on Kerala history, but many of you are, but it is recorded that Manavikrama, at least from the 12th century onwards, was the only name that was given to male members in the royal family. The Zamorin was always known as the Manavikrama, and that is precisely the reason why in Chinese records, particularly in the Ming Shirlu, there is a reference to Manavikraman. And on this second voyage that Changha took, that is between 1407 and 1409, the interesting thing is that there was a memorial or a stone tablet from the emperor, which is said to have been erected in the heart of Kozhikode city. According to some historians, Changha himself was not here during this particular handover of the tablet, but in his place there were two eunuchs that are recorded to have visited Kozhikode. One was Wang Jinghong and the other was Ho Xian. Ho Xian is the same person I mentioned in the context of the gift that was sent from Bengal to the Chinese emperor. But these two eunuchs were in command of the treasure fleet, and they erected a stone tablet here in Kozhikode and a pavilion to commemorate the investiture ceremony. And the inscription reads this: though the journey, and this is the inscription that is believed to be on that particular tablet, though the journey from this country to the Middle Kingdom is more than 100,000 li. Li is the unit of distance that is used by the Chinese that translates to roughly 500 meters or half a kilometer. Though the journey from this country to the Middle Kingdom is more than 100,000 li, yet the people are very similar, happy and prosperous with identical customs. We have here engraved a stone, a perpetual declaration for 10,000 ages. Quite poignant. According to other scholars, Changha may have actually, the reason why Changha is associated with the handover of this particular tablet is that he might have actually arrived later, because if the promulgation of the order was in 1407, his ship might have actually come here in 1408. By then the tablet would have already been installed here. The reason why the record of this tablet inscription being in Calicut is genuine is because a similar stele was installed in Ceylon. And another eunuch's name also accompanies Changha's name in the trilingual inscription, which is dated February 1409 at Gaul in Ceylon. This was the tablet inscription that was recovered in Sri Lanka. It is now available for people to visit and view in the National Museum there. And the writing on this tablet is in Chinese, Persian and Tamil characters. And this is similar to the same tablet inscription that is described as having been erected in Kozhikode. Jungler's third mission was promulgated in 1409, and this was Changha's third voyage. Again, in this particular voyage, it is believed that he hosted the Shamiti or the Zamorin's emissary on the return voyage, together with envoys from several other places who submitted their tribute in the month of August 1411, whereupon they received ceremonial gifts, silk, paper money, and so on. According to the Ming Shirlu, the Calicut envoy was invited to a reception on 18th September 1411. So on the third mission, when the mission returns, Changha brings back with him the Zamorin's ambassador, who, it is recorded in a specific entry, was invited to a reception at the Ming court in September 1411. Zheng He's fourth expedition was dated between 1412 and 1415. And why this expedition was interesting was that this time he was accompanied by an interpreter called Ma Huan, and Ma Huan was an interpreter for Arabic. So for the first three voyages, when historians point out that Calicut was their final destination, from the fourth voyage onwards, they started to look at places beyond Calicut, and that is possibly the reason why they had an Arabic interpreter this time. In this particular entry, it is mentioned that ambassadors from Calicut, Kochi, interestingly. So now when you start evaluating the importance of geographic spaces, gradually the importance of Alva, Kollam recedes, and slowly Guli becomes very important, and gradually somewhere Kochi also starts becoming important when you look at the entries that are there in the Mingxia Lu, and this is dated sometime in 1415. Visits to farther places such as Liushan. Liushan was the name that they used for the Liu Islands, Lakshadweep Islands, and also more proximate to the Maldives. Seal was delivered to Khurchar or Kochi. So from the time of the fourth visit, the importance that the Ming begin to place on other places apart from Calicut also starts to emerge, the importance to Kochi, for example. And it is believed that a tablet was also erected to celebrate the event. Zheng He's fifth expedition was recorded as being undertaken between 1416 and 1420. And in this particular visit, there is an entry in the Mingxia Lu which suggests that Calicut, this time the Zamarin sent a mealy cow. A mealy cow is the Indian antelope, the nilgai, is recorded to have been sent by the Zamarin to China. During the 1417 trip, Kochi, upon the request of the king then, they requested Zheng He, and Zheng He conferred the imperial title on the king on behalf of the Yongle emperor and presented his decree and silver seal, and also symbolically named a central mountain somewhere in Kochi as Chanquoshan, which means a mountain that serves as a national guard. Now, why this is interesting is, especially when people recount the rivalries that existed between Calicut and Kochi, and the aggressive overtures that Calicut was beginning to make, possibly because of the annoyance with the rise that Kochi was seeing as an important trading destination. Possibly this gives us a sense as to why the emperor might have been interested to also symbolically express his support for Kochi during that time. Yongle's next order was for 1421, excuse me. Yongle's next order, as I mentioned, was for 1421, and the return trip is dated very shortly as 1422. This was his sixth expedition, and this was some kind of a return trip that was made for the envoys of 16 nations who had visited China previously. Zheng He takes off in 1421 after relieving these ambassadors. He returns in 1422. It is interesting to note that despite the fact that Zheng He's visit or voyage is recorded to have ended in 1422, there are entries in the Mingxia Lu for 1423 where ambassadors were sent from Calicut and Kochi, implying therefore that besides Zheng He's voyages, there were other ships that were functioning between these maritime routes. Subsequently, you have gap years between 1425 and 1431. This was the result of a complete halt that was announced in September 1424, a complete halt to the great maritime expeditions, permitting only foreign envoys to be accompanied back for their return journeys. Chinese maritime activities in the Indian Ocean were drastically cut. This time, of course, there was a change in the rule there, and under the Hongxi emperor, according to the famous historian Fitzgerald, already Hongxi, having been a sick man, he only survived for 10 months after he announced this particular halt to maritime outreach voyages. And subsequently, when he is succeeded by his son, the Emperor Shuanda. Shuanda was again very famous because he tried to revive the voyages subsequently, but because when he took over he was still young, there was no immediate reversal on his father's policy, and that is why for the period between 1425 and 1431, you have no connections which are recorded in the Ming Shirlu between Calicut and China for that period. The last imperial edict for the 7th voyage, Zheng He's last voyage, was made in the month of June 1430. The expedition set out sometime in 1431 or 1432. There are various entries to both years. And this expedition is recorded to have visited Southeast Asian countries. This expedition is recorded to have visited the African coast as well. On the 7th voyage, Zheng He was accompanied by other travelers like Fei Xin, Kung Chen, and Ma Huan again, possibly implying that the need for an interpreter was there because of the visit further to the Persian Gulf in all likelihood. Calicut is clearly mentioned as one of Zheng He's destinations. The interesting thing for all of us gathered here is that according to historians like Roderick Putter, there are studies by Cheng Yi Chun and Chuang Wei Che. They are historians who point out, and it is indeed a matter of fascination for most of us, that Zheng He passed away in Calicut during that return passage. According to historians, the voyage does not return to Peking until July 1433, but in the month of March 1433, Zheng He was in Calicut. That is recorded, but subsequently, when the ship leaves Calicut onwards to China, only his mortal remains eventually reach China. According to a Ming Shirlu entry, Calicut had also sent an ambassador to the Chinese court on that last voyage. Now, Shuanda, the emperor that I mentioned, who came in terms of the line, Shuanda is recounted to be slightly more popular than Hongxi, but less popular than Yongle, who was, paramount in allowing these voyages to flourish. But Shuanda, again, he reigned only for 10 years. At the time of his death, the rule passed to his child of 8 years, his son Chantung. And after Shuanda, the last voyage under Chengtung is recorded for August 1436. Of course, this was the last voyage that is recorded to this part in terms of, Zheng He already having died by then. In this particular voyage, envoys from 11 countries, including Calicut, Kochi, Kanpali possibly refers to, these are not modern place names. So most historians identify Kanpali with either Cape Comorin or with Coimbatore, one of these two places, and they were sent back to their countries along with the Javanese envoy Kuoshin. Beyond the year 1436, the interchange, exchange, trade, navigation that happens was believed to have been certainly conducted by private merchants operating from the Chinese coastal provinces or perhaps from Southeast Asia. In terms of the final voyages, it is very interesting to remind ourselves again that Chinese records, particularly records from the Ming dynasty, give us a fascinating insights into the accounts of successive emperors of China. This is particularly important for the period that we are looking at, 14th and 15th century, which are usually marked by a dearth of external sources elsewhere. We need to remind ourselves again that this was a fantastic period of outreach and exploration. There were 25 eunuch-led voyages between 1403 and the 1430s, including Zheng He's 7 voyages. So besides Zheng He, there were other voyages, and you might be surprised why these voyages were eunuch-led. According to many historians, the debate went like this: because the emperor would not want male members to be proximate to his concubines, usually eunuchs were entrusted with that duty, and that is how eunuchs became very powerful in the court system. This was, however, not something that court officials were very happy with. But nonetheless, that was the reason why you have so many eunuchs leading these expeditions. It was considered a matter of pride. So families would actually sacrifice a male member to serve in the court of the emperor during that time. There are at least 27 references to envoys from Calicut being banqueted by the Ming court between 1405 and 1436. Historians note that an interesting argument for the end of the voyages was that these expeditions were portrayed as being extravagant excesses inspired by eunuch cupidity pandering to the vanity of court ladies. It was said that they were sent out to collect useless curios, baubles, and novelties to satisfy the ideal curiosity of concubines. The court, of course, because officials were engaged and they were paying for these voyages, and you can imagine big voyages with the number of ships that I mentioned, because the court had to use ordinary revenue for the navy, and because ordinary revenue was being now controlled by eunuchs, this created some kind of a red flag for court officials. Investment in private trade was clearly a proper activity for eunuchs. Why? Because again, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, as a class of people who could not own land, eunuchs became backers of private enterprise, among others. And Harprasad Ray also notes that all of this was resulting in some kind of internal resistance within China against such huge expeditions, and it was some kind of an opposition that was being presented by court officials to the rise of eunuch power, abetted also possibly by the complicity of court officials with private traders. Another factor was the decline of sea power. The Ming dynasty was of southern origin. Its first two sovereigns, they ruled from Nanjing, but subsequently the capital eventually shifted to Beijing, the north capital. Inevitably, the emperors became northern-minded, preoccupied with the northern land frontiers. The south usually did not demand the emperor's attention, even on state business. There were no real dangerous enemies to guard against down in the south, but their engagement in the north, especially a few hours ride from Beijing up in the north, and the fact that there were Mongols there who were seen as a constant nuisance meant that their attention increasingly became northern-minded. Plus, there was the menace of piracy that had begun over time. For about 35 years, Chinese ships were being sent on official missions, and perhaps there were others, many more, on private ones. They regularly called at Calicut. According to historians, the Chinese referred to other people in the Indian Ocean as barbarians, but they treated the Zamorin as an equal and had utmost respect for his highly structured society with an efficient civil service, a well-trained army and a navy, and a system of justice just like the Chinese emperors. And the Zamorins were patrons of literature and the arts. The evolution of maritime outreach to this part of the world also reveals the economic and political relevance of the geographic spaces that we inhabit. As I mentioned previously, from the discussion on the kind of places that were populating the entries in official court records, it is evident that during the Yuan period, possibly places like Alva, which was known as Xiali, or Kollam, might have been more important compared to subsequent Ming dynasty periods where the description on Kuli and Khercher, Kozhikode and Kochi become much more important. And of course, as I mentioned, this is in sync with the fact that, Kochi only became important in the second half of the 14th century. The other interesting aspect looking at China's connections to this part of the world is that insights into our own society are gleaned from the study of those travel writings, such as in the works of Ma Huan, who traveled with Zheng He. He notes that in the context of Calicut, the king is not succeeded by his son, but by his sister's son, because his nephew, being born of his sister's body, is considered nearer to him by blood. Scholars like Harprasad Ray also note that contrary to the traditionally held view, trade that was carried out through these voyages was actually a lucrative affair in the sense that it had to be a free market system that was enabling these trading arrangements to be set up. Prices were being determined on the basis of day-to-day market prices. although trade was a state monopoly, the fact is that bartering was being done based on negotiated prices, and only ships that could enter Chinese ports were the ones that actually carried tributary trade. So it gives us an insight also into aspects of our own society, of how trade was being regulated at that time. There are two inscriptions that were set up by Cheng He in China, and by Cheng He and his associates in 1431. This, if you would remember the timeline I had shared with you, was before his last voyage. He set up these two commemorative inscriptions, one of which you can see on your screen. One was at Lujiakang in Jiangsu province. Lujiakang was the Shanghai of its day. And the other one was set up in Fujian province in a place called Changla. And only one of them has been recovered in Fujian province. The end of Chinese presence in places like Calicut is roughly dated to the beginning of the 16th century, again based on accounts of people like the Joseph of Cragnanor, recorded in the Novus Orbis, of how there seems to have been increasing Arab influence, Arab traders in connivance with the Zamorin, who was not very keen on how the Chinese were trying to encourage Kochi as well. Possibly those are, these are all possible reasons why it is recorded, particularly in the Novus Orbis, that, people of Cathay were treated badly. They quit that city and returned no more. But to sort of remind ourselves, it's useful to again note that Cheng He made these grand voyages in more than 30 countries. The nature of these trips, the nature of that outreach was clearly very different, even in terms of the experience we subsequently had with the Portuguese. Say, for example, compared to the Ming, Portuguese, they claimed absolute sovereignty over the sea waters. They went on to monopolize pepper trade, hurting local producers. In terms of accounts by historians like Edward Dreyer, the voyages to this part of the world were not the product of lobbying by a maritime industry that was interested in promoting trade and colonization, if we compare it to the later Western European experience that we had a century later. Other scholars have also noted that the idea of the tributary trade was conducted more for prestige reasons. These tributary transactions were usually conducted in favor of the recipient more than in favor of the Chinese court. And we also know that there is not much mention of any settlement community or coveting of territory that happens through these voyages.